The GTX 970. One of the cards released after the initial test run of NVIDIA's new Maxwell 2.0 architecture in the second batch, the GTX 970 and GTX 980 dropped just a short while after the 750 Ti. And while the new efficiency of the 750 Ti's Maxwell chip was considered incredible in February of 2014, just 7 months later that same efficiency was showcased in NVIDIA's new cards on September 19th of the same year. The 980 was held in high regard due to the pure performance, but the 970 had a different calling feature: efficiency. Every reviewer from the time had to have a talking point about the efficiency, and for very good reason. The performance per watt for these cards was insane, even knowing ahead of time what to expect from reviewing the 750 Ti, and wow was it overclockable. People were getting similar if not better performance on an overclocked 970 than they were a 980. The value was solid too. Really, this Maxwell 2.0 release was just an all-around improvement. The value, the performance, the efficiency, heck, even the noise with the new 0 RPM fan cooler designs. The model I've snagged here is the MSI GTX 970 gaming model, which I found for $35. They go for around $35 to $45 right now. Starting off with what all 970s have in common, it had 1,664 shading units and a 256-bit memory bus paired with 4 GB of GDDR5 memory. Turns out, while NVIDIA said its models had 4 GB of memory, it really had more like 3.5 GB plus 0.5 GB. The larger section was running at the full speed, but that final half a gig was actually running at a significantly lower speed, meaning if you went over 3.5 gigs of VRAM, you might start seeing lots of stuttering, inconsistent frame times, and generally just poor performance. NVIDIA caught some heat with that move back in the day. Anyways, back to the specs. The MSI variant here runs at a base clock of 1114 MHz with an advertised boost of 1253 MHz. Memory ran at 1753 MHz, or at least most of it. TDP was around 148 watts, with this card replacing one of the two standard 6 pins with an 8-pin power connector. This was of course on the Maxwell 2.0 architecture, and thankfully is still getting security drivers to this day, most recent being from June 13th. The rest of the benchmark system is the same, an Intel Core i7-8700 non-K paired with 32 GB of dual-channel DDR4 memory running at 3200 MHz. And before I ran the benchmarks, I did an initial, simple, straightforward overclock on this card that anyone could do at home with just a bit of time and attention. Running Unigine Heaven, I brought the max power limit up by 10%. I then brought up the core clock and watched the benchmark run for a bit. If I saw any artifacting, stutters, or it crashed, I dropped it back down. I then did the same thing for the memory clocks. With more time and sacrificing noise for lower thermals and bringing up voltages, I might have been able to squeeze a bit more, but I like to explain and use my very basic, rudimentary form of overclocking to show you don't need to know the card's architecture in and out, or set the fans to max and give up on noise to get some extra performance out of it. Just some time, patience, and observance, and you could get some extra frames out of your card without much hassle. Of course, if you wanted to set the fans to max and find the sweet spot for clock increases, you could definitely do better than me. And if that interests you, then go for it, I think it's cool. But for an average Joe with not a lot of time, this is a decent enough method in my opinion. I ended up with plus 175 MHz on the core and plus 125 MHz on the memory. And all the benchmarks ran today are with this overclock applied. Now, I think it's finally the GTX 970's time to show what it's still able to run in the here and now. We'll be starting off the benchmarks with some DirectX 12 games, and today we actually have a card recent enough to just barely boot Forza Horizon 6. It says our drivers are just a tad too old, but it still runs. So diving right in, at 1080p on the low preset, we got 55.8 FPS average with our 1% lows at 42.5. Honestly, a lot better than I was expecting. Dropping the resolution to say 1600 by 900 and you'd be hitting 60 easy. But already at 1080, it's so close I wouldn't bother. Oh, and if 30 FPS is fine with you, running at 1080p on high actually got us 35.3 average with lows to 31.4. Overall, not bad for a pretty recent game, an 11-year-old card that I got for $35. Up next is Cyberpunk 2077, which I normally say is more intensive than Forza 5, but Forza 6 I'm not sure about. So we'll see right now. At 1080p native on medium, we were returned with 51.3 average and 1% lows at 41.4. Honestly, I'm still pretty impressed. And using FSR 2.1 on balanced, we got even closer to the magical 60 FPS target. Average FPS of 56.8 and 46.7 lows. Again, admirable. Looks like you can give an old GPU new games. I don't know if I'd take the quality loss to FSR over the few extra frames though, but it shows that it actually is a little more efficient than Forza 6. That's kind of interesting. On to another game that says our drivers are out of date with Helldivers 2. Continuing, it runs fine, so whatever I guess. With the game set at 1080p native on the low preset, we achieved an average of 66 FPS with 1% lows to 60.3. This is a way more powerful card than I was giving it credit for. A solid 60 FPS even in lows is crazy. Most of the other recent cards I've tested, I need to drop the resolution too. Well, in this case, I decided to see how high a preset I could pick while still keeping the game pretty playable. We ended up on the high preset with an average of 33.9 and lows down to 31.5. Very impressed with this one. Finally, for DirectX 12 games, we have the new BeamNG version 0.39, which has a massive graphics overhaul. I might have to retest a couple of older cards just to see if they can handle it now. Either way, the 970 has DirectX 12 support, obviously, so that shouldn't be a problem. Running the game at 1080p on normal, the GTX 970 gave us 55.7 FPS on average and had 1% lows down to 48.4. For the game looking this good and the reminder $35 price tag, I'm kind of blown away. Still getting drivers for now, full DX12 support, and pretty solid performance. Gotta say, this card might be one of my favorites out of the ones I ran, although my 750 Ti will always have my heart. Now we're on to games that run on Vulkan, starting with Doom Eternal. And this card actually has a usable amount of VRAM with 4GB, so we might be able to even turn up some settings. So, on the high preset at 1080p native, we had 67.2 average and lows to 54.7. Smooth, pretty consistent. Some points it could go down to more like the low 50s, some points more like the high 70s, but either way it ran fantastic. And worst case, you want a locked 60? Just lower the preset by one level, or even just a couple settings for your choice. Or, now that I think about it, try to get VRAM usage under that 3.5 gigs, so you're not using that slower half gig at the top. Either way, Doom Eternal is giving me hope for the other Vulkan titles I have here. Here we've got No Man's Sky. Last time I tried this game, it didn't go so well. That was the 780 though. This GPU is giving me hope for a better experience, maybe? So, trying it at 1080p native on the enhanced preset, and it was a much better experience. Average of 53.1 with lows down to 37.7. It was actually enjoyable. I think that 1% low may have been a random stutter causing it to drop, because right after this I tried to hit a 60 FPS target with some FSR 2.1, and didn't see the same kind of low. Speaking of which, using FSR 2.1 set to quality with the same other settings, we got an average of 61.5 with 1% lows down to 50.5. This was on the planet, just flying around, and also part of it was during a storm. I ended up zooming across the surface, just collecting a bunch of materials because it just felt good to play. I'm super impressed. Now onto the DirectX 11 games. Wish I had more Vulkan games, but unfortunately at the moment I don't. Just making do with what I got. So now for a classic with Deep Rock Galactic. And even in the station here I was getting above 60 FPS. Pretty good sign. And sure enough, at 1080p native on Ultra we had an amazing experience. 158.3 FPS average with 152.2 lows. Smooth and fast, nothing really to know. Well, except for the lack of fan noise. This is the first game where I really got a sense for just how efficient this card is. It barely tapped 70 degrees, and the fans were nice and quiet the whole time. And remember, this is with an overclock and the power limit raised too. Risk of Rain 2 is up next, one of my favorites to test because, well, it's one of my favorite games. Running at 1080p native with max settings and using Artifact Swarms to double the amount of enemies that spawn to hopefully get a bit more accurate number with a little more going on. And through the first stage, we got 178 average with lows of 134. And again, late game, you will definitely see this number drop, but this is at max settings, so you could definitely afford a few graphics settings drops if you end up needing to. Next up, a competitive game with Counter-Strike 2. Recently had some troubles with AMD cards and shader caching, so I can't wait to finally have a good round on first benchmark run. And sure enough, using the benchmark map found on the Steam Workshop, we got some impressive results yet again. 304 FPS average with 1% lows to 143. Pretty square above the 144 FPS mark, even on the lows. And also, unlike the recent AMD cards, I have the option, finally, for 1440 by 1080 benchmarks for that wide mode. Running with the same settings, we of course got a higher FPS since, well, less pixels to push. Average of 344.5 with lows to 148.5. This benchmark is representative of a pretty average game of CS2, so you might see slightly lower on more intensive maps or slightly higher FPS values mayhaps, but I guarantee they'll be pretty dang good either way. And finally, to round off the benchmarks, as per usual, it's Minecraft. Currently is still OpenGL, I believe, but it'll have a Vulkan rewrite at some point, and I can't wait to see the performance differences when it's all said and done. For now, though, just sticking with Old Faithful. Well, not the actual Faithful resource pack, but oh, you know. Sodium and Iris running with the complementary reimagined shaders set to the high preset, we got our final result. 63.1 FPS average with 1% lows down to 57.1. Overall, once again, stable results. Although, during gameplay actually, I would get a stutter every once in a while, probably due to loading a new chunk, but it was pretty playable. And in the jungle area I spawned, the FPS was quite a bit lower, more like the 45 to 50 range, but it looks glorious. And worst case, if you want 60, just drop the preset by 1 or lower your render distance a little bit. Every time I run Minecraft with these complementary reimagined shaders, it always blows me away. Forgive me taking screenshots like a nerd, please. Now onto the synthetics with the 3D marks. On Firestrike, we had a total of 13,813, which puts it pretty solidly above the GTX 780 and just a bit below the GTX 1060 6GB, which I argue is a fantastic place to sit. I think it can be found for quite a bit cheaper than a 1060 and about the same price, if not still a tad lower than a 780, making it a pretty good pick. TimeSpy reinforces that same narrative with a score of 4,117, pretty well ahead of the 780 and just a bit behind the 1060 6GB. I honestly think if this card had the same 6 gigs of VRAM, it would be pretty neck and neck with the 1060. Steel Nomad is where we finally see the 1060 pull ahead, where the 970 got a score of 648. The 1060 got a much higher score in this one, and considering this benchmark is representative of modern, unoptimized games, this might be where the 1060 is a better choice, although it's also quite a bit more expensive as far as I can tell, so keep that in mind. Well, final thoughts. It has astounding performance for the price, and I'm honestly confused as to why it doesn't cost more. For the cost of this card, you get quite a bit of gaming performance, modern drivers, and, depending on the model, quiet performance with good overclocking headroom. Handles older games like a dream, modern games it struggles with but can just about pull ahead, and it runs anything in between pretty well. It makes me pretty excited to test out the 980 and 980 Ti when I get around to it. But yeah, I'm impressed with this card in almost every aspect. If you need a decent card on the cheap, this just might be it.